All right. Making sure that on YouTube can be seen. All right. There we go. All right. All right, ladies and germs. We are at part three of the Kerner Commission. This is going to be on chapter 5, Rejection and Protest, an historical sketch. With my guest, BGS Edmore. How you doing today, sir? BGS, you there?
I'm here.
Okay. Now, just saying, how you doing today, sir?
Pretty good, sir.
All right. So, for all those who are coming, we're going to go ahead and start. As normal, we're going to be playing the audio from the LibreVox recording and then showing the document on screen. And then at just various points, we're going to stop and talk. But without further ado, let's go ahead and start. Okay.
Section 24 of the
Can you
Kerner
hear that
Commission
okay?
report.
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah.
This is a
Okay.
LibreVox recording. All LibreVox recordings are in the public domain.
Go ahead and play it at
For more
1.25.
information or to
Yeah.
volunteer, please visit LibreVox.org.
Settings.
Report of the National Advisory Committee on Civil Disorders. Kerner Commission Report. Chapter 5, Rejection and Protest, an Historical Sketch, Part 1. Introduction. The events of the summer of 1967 are in large part the culmination of 300 years of racial prejudice. Most Americans know little of the origins of the racial schism separating our white and Negro citizens. Few appreciate how central the problem of the Negro has been to our social policy. Fewer still understand that today's problems can be solved only if white Americans comprehend the rigid social, economic, and educational barriers that have prevented Negroes from participating in the mainstream of American life. Only a handful realize that Negro accommodation to the patterns of prejudice in American culture has been but one side of the coin. For as slaves and as free men, Negroes have protested against oppression and have persistently sought equality in American society. What follows is neither a history of the Negro in the United States nor an account of Negro protest movements. Rather, it is a brief narrative of a few historical events that illustrate the facts of rejection and the forms of protest. We call on history not to justify, but to help explain for Black and white Americans a state of mind.
What do you think about the introduction, BGS?
Yeah, it's a pretty good overview, and they're right. This is something similar to what Moynihan put in his the Negro family about the abuse and the separation, the legal separation between Negroes and the white society, the broader society, really, and how Negroes weren't included. So it's pretty much the same thing. They also said the same thing back in the Mohawk Conference of 1890 about how do you integrate Negroes, because Lincoln wanted to deport all black folks.
Yeah, he did.
So they never really. It was
To
not his
Liberia, right?
to Liberia, Haiti, and what we call Belize now, which is British Honduras.
Yeah, because I think when you talk to white people about this stuff, if they're willing to have that conversation, what I really find with white people is that they have a soft view of what racism was in this country. And
Yeah.
they don't understand the integral parts about what was done, the policies, what was even after slavery. They think, oh, everything was okay, and it's like, no, it wasn't. There were central policies put in place to where we were not allowed to be a part of this country. We were like the substrata of the
We
country.
were semi-slaves because what people don't know, what they doesn't get included, because we think it's about morals, and it wasn't. It's about money. Because just before the Civil War, okay, the South and slavery was responsible for like 70-80% of the United States wealth. In other words, the money that was made and the wealth was actually came from the South. This is why the Civil War was fought in the first place, to keep the South from leaving. But once you freed the slaves, right? Freed the slaves, freed your labor force. Okay, guess what? You're not making
Not making no money.
no money. What do you have to do?
Well, you got to imprison them and then use them as prisoners to
You,
justify
you
putting them
got to
back
put
on.
got to put them back on the land, doing what they're doing before.
Yeah,
So
so it's like,
that's what Jim Crow was about.
yep, it was pretty much you're free only in name only.
Your free and name on, yeah, yeah. Well, what is it? I think there's a book called Slavery by Another Name.
Hmm.
Yeah, and then it really the culmination of why the civil rights actually worked in the 60s, 50s and 60s, because the farming machines came in, and guess what? You didn't need on the land anymore.
The slaves.
The slaves, the black folks. That's like I'm gonna remember. Well, I think it was earlier in the piece. I think it was maybe the first section where they were talking about the Negroes coming from the South off the land into the city, into the urban cities, looking for jobs because there
Hmm.
wasn't work any place where they were at. That's
Yeah.
why. So that's what a lot of that was actually caused by, the ghettos are actually caused by the Negroes coming from the South because they're out of work and coming into the urban centers for work, and
Yeah, they were
that's
looking
where
for prosperity.
looking for prosperity. Well, hell, they were dirt poor where they were coming from. They're starving, so they had to
Hmm.
come into the cities, and that's when the North got a Southern problem. Also, you got this big flood of Negroes coming into the urban center and overcrowding it, and it caused these conditions. But yeah, it's a and that's what they're saying. The white folks are not really integrating black folks into the society, which is what you're supposed to do. Is the basis of all this. That's what the
Hmm.
Kerner Commission is saying. Go ahead.
All right.
You want to say
Let's
something
continue.
else? You got it. Okay.
No, no, that was it. I just do a quick little talk about the introduction, but we'll
Yeah.
go ahead and continue.
Colonial period. 20 years after Columbus reached the New World, African Negroes, transported by Spanish, Dutch, and Portuguese traders, were arriving in the Caribbean islands. Almost all came as slaves. By 1600, there were more than 500,000 slaves in the Western Hemisphere. In colonial America, the first Negroes landed at Jamestown in August 1619. Within 40 years, Negroes had become a group apart, separated from the rest of the population by custom and law. Treated as servants for life, forbidden to intermarry with whites, deprived of their African traditions, and dispersed among southern plantations, American Negroes lost tribal, regional, and family ties. Through massive importation, their numbers increased rapidly. By 1776, some 500,000 Negroes were held in slavery and indentured servitude in the United States. Nearly 1 of every 6 persons in the country was a slave. Americans disapproved a preliminary draft of the Declaration of Independence that indicted the King of England for waging cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Instead, they approved a document that proclaimed all men are created equal. The statement was an ideal, a promise, but it excluded the Negroes who were held in bondage, as well as the few who were free men.
Imagine that.
The conditions in which Negroes lived had already led to protests.
Money matters, does it
So
not?
violence was present almost from the beginning of the American experience. Throughout the 18th century, the danger of Negro revolts obsessed many white Americans.
Hmm.
Slave plots of considerable scope were uncovered in New York in 1712 and 1714, and they resulted in bloodshed. Whites and Negroes were slain. Negroes were at first barred from serving in the Revolutionary Army, recruiting officers having been ordered in July 1775 to enlist no stroller, Negro, or vagabond. Yet Negroes were already actively involved in the struggle for independence. Crispus Attucks, a Boston Negro, was perhaps the first American to die for freedom, and Negroes had already fought in the battles at Lexington and Concord. They were among the soldiers at Bunker Hill. Fearing that
Hmm.
Negroes would enlist in the British Army, which welcomed them, and facing a manpower shortage, the
Hmm.
Continental Army accepted free Negroes.
Yeah, that's what they
Many
did.
slaves did join the
Yeah.
British, and according to an estimate by Thomas Jefferson, more than 30,000 Virginia slaves ran away in 1778 alone, presumably to enlist.
Yeah.
The states enrolled both free and slave Negroes, and finally Congress authorized military service for slaves who were to be emancipated in return for their service. By the end of the war, about 5,000 Negroes had been in the ranks of the Continental Army. Those who had been slaves became free.
Hmm.
Yeah. So it's very funny that the first person to die for this country was a Negro.
Was
But
that
yeah,
it? Yeah.
we can't get no
Oh,
damn respect.
yeah. He was drunk though.
Hey, he died.
He died though. Yeah, that's
He
true.
died for the country. Don't matter. But I mean, throughout all this, what I'm seeing is that blacks or slaves, by another name in this context,
Hmm.
wanted to get away from their oppression.
Yeah.
So they were
Yeah.
trying to at least fight for their right, or at least run away from it. That's why they were trying to go to the British.
Yeah.
Some wanted to enlist in the army to try to show that we can be part of this country,
Hmm.
but white society at large just said no. He was like,
Yeah, well, yeah, yeah.
we are the
They were making.
superior being.
Yeah, it was superior being, and plus they were making too much money.
Hmm. So, and yes, this is I don't know if you can see it. It says to be sold on board the ship Tuesday, May 6th. This is
Hmm.
the Wynyard and Rice car.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. I guess this is like a newspaper clipping that they had out here.
Yeah, an
Talking about
advertisement.
smallpox on the slave ships. All right, Constitution and the laws.
The Constitution and the laws. Massachusetts abolished slavery in 1783, and Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York soon provided for gradual liberation. But relatively few Negroes lived in these states. The bulk of the Negro population was in the South, where white Americans had fortunes invested in slaves.
Hmm.
Although the Congress banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, delegates at the Constitutional Convention compromised. A slave was counted as 3/5 of a person for determining the number of representatives from a state to Congress. Congress was prohibited from restricting the slave trade until after 1808,
Hmm.
and the free states were required to return fugitive slaves to their southern owners.
Hmm.
Growing numbers of slaves in the South became permanently fastened in bondage, and slavery spread into new southern regions. When more slaves were needed for the cotton and sugar plantations in the Southwest, they were ordered from the Negro raising states of the Old South, or, despite congressional prohibition of the slave trade, imported from Africa. The laws of bondage became even more institutionalized. Masters retained absolute authority over their Negroes, who were unable to leave their masters' properties without written permission. Any white person, even those who owned no slaves, and they outnumbered slaveholders 6-1, could challenge a truant slave and turn him over to a public official. Slaves could own no property, could enter into no contract, not even a contract of marriage, and had no right to assemble in public unless a white person was present. They had no standing in the courts. Discrimination as a doctrine.
Pretty much treated you like
The
pets.
situation was
Yeah,
hardly
they
better
still do
for
that. We
Negroes.
can't assemble.
A few had material
Yeah, more than
success.
4, huh?
Some even owned slaves themselves, but the vast majority knew only poverty. Forbidden to settle in some areas, segregated in others, they were targets of prejudice and discrimination. In the South, they were denied freedom of movement, severely restricted in their choice of occupation, and forbidden to associate with whites or with slaves. They lived in constant danger of being enslaved. Whites could challenge their freedom, and an infraction of the law could put them into bondage. In both North and South, they were regularly victims of mobs. In 1829, for example, white residents invaded Cincinnati's Little Africa, killed Negroes, burned their property, and ultimately drove half the Negro population from the city. Some Americans, Washington and Jefferson among them, advocated the gradual emancipation of slaves. And in the 19th century, a movement to abolish slavery grew in importance and strength. A few white abolitionist leaders wanted full equality for Negroes, but others sought only to eliminate the institution itself. And some anti-slavery societies, fearing that Negro members would unnecessarily offend those who were unsympathetic with abolitionist principles, denied entrance to Negroes. Most Americans were, in fact, against abolishing slavery. They refused to rent their halls for anti-slavery meetings. They harassed abolitionist leaders who sought to educate white and Negro children together. They attacked those involved in the movement. Mobs sometimes killed abolitionists and destroyed their property. A large body of literature came into existence to prove that the Negro was imperfectly developed in mind and body, that he belonged to a lower order of man, that slavery was right on ethnic, economic, and social grounds, quoting the scriptures in support. Spreading rapidly during the first part of the 19th century, slavery held less than 1 million Negroes in 1800, but almost 4 million by 1860. Although some few white Americans had freed their slaves, most increased their holdings, for the invention of the cotton gin had made cotton the heart of the Southern economy. By mid-century, slavery in the South had become a systematic and aggressive way of treating a whole race of people. The despair of the Negroes was evident. Malingering and sabotage tormented every slaveholder. The problem of runaway slaves was endemic. Some slaves, Gabriel Prosser in 1800, Denmark Vesey in 1822, Nat Turner in 1831, and others, turned to violence, and the sporadic uprisings that flared demonstrated a deep protest against a demeaning way of life. Negroes who had material resources expressed their distress in other ways. In 1816, Paul Cuffey, Negro philanthropist and owner of a fleet of ships, transported a group of Negroes to a new home in Sierra Leone. 40 years later, Martin R. Delaney, Negro editor and physician, also urged Negroes to settle elsewhere. Equality of treatment and acceptance by the society at large were myths, and Negro protests during the first half of the 19th century took the form of rhetoric, spoken and written, which combined denunciation of undemocratic oppression together with pleas to the conscience of white Americans for the redress of grievances and the recognition of their constitutional rights. A few Negroes joined white Americans who believed that only Negro emigration to Africa would solve racial problems, but most Negroes equated that program with banishment and felt themselves entitled to participate in the blessings of America. The National Negro Convention movement, formed in 1830, held conferences to publicize on a national scale the evils of slavery and the indignities heaped on free Negroes.
So when they were talking about the whole slavery and the what's in the Bible, right?
Uh-huh.
I find it funny that they never mention the whole entire text, because even in the Bible, it states that once you free the person that is indentured to you, you're supposed to give them something.
Yeah, you're supposed to give them
but
you're supposed to pay them and give them a way to a way
live.
to actually live. Yeah, train them and give them a start so they can
Yeah.
go live on their own. Yep.
Yeah, which they never really did to us.
No, because that's why they reduced us to cattle or chattel.
Mm-hmm.
In property.
And that's pretty much what cattle slavery.
Because the initial slaves, even the ones in 1619, there was no process for lifetime servitude, right? They were indentured servants just like everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it was in Virginia, they changed that. They changed that law.
Yeah, because Virginia was the number one slave state, right? That's what they said in this.
Yeah, Virginia and South Carolina were the number one slave states.
Mm-hmm.
I think Maryland was third.
Mm-hmm. And what else did they say in here? Like the slave revolts, like with Nat Turner and Gabrielle and Vesey, that started to come up.
Oh yeah, that was in the 19th century, but there was continuous slave revolts. That's like slaves used to switch sides during the Revolutionary War, fight on the side of the British or fight on the side of the Americans, or even sometimes the Spanish. So there was all kinds of revolts and switching of sides. That's like toward the beginning of the 19th century, they actually wanted to deport all Negroes. They wanted to get them out of here because they would switch sides, or they didn't feel they could trust them. Because of slavery, they think they were always how can I say under pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So even today, that's like they don't trust black men because of that history.
Yeah, they still don't.
Yeah.
Because if they were smart, they would have had us go to Africa before China. But
they tried. They remember that's what Liberia was. Liberia was actually established by the United States for slaves, and then I think the British established Sierra Leone for their slaves. So they were trying to deport them. But the thing is that slaves made America too much money. That's how come they didn't.
I still need to read that Patterson book. I'm gonna read that after I go through this. Let's see. I think it was right here. The Moral Reform Society.
Mm-hmm.
American Moral Reform Society, founded by Negroes in 1834, rejected racial separatism and advocated uplifting the whole human race without distinction as to complexion. Other Negro reformers pressed for stronger racial consciousness and solidarity as the means to overcome racial barriers. Many took direct action to help slaves escape through the Underground Railroad. A few resisted discrimination by political action, even though most Negroes were barred from voting. Frustration, disillusionment, anger, and fantasy marked the Negroes' protest against the place in American society assigned to them. I was free, Harriet Tubman said, but there was no one to welcome me in the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land. When Frederick Douglass, the distinguished Negro abolitionist, addressed the citizens of Rochester on Independence Day, 1852, he told them, "The 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn." To drag a man into the grand illuminated Temple of Liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions, whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilant shouts that reach them.
Happy
The
Juneteenth.
path toward civil war. The 1850s brought Negroes increasing despair, as the problem of slavery was debated by the nation's leaders. The Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 settled no basic issues, and the Dred Scott case in 1857 confirmed Negroes in their understanding that they were not citizens and thus not entitled to the constitutional safeguards enjoyed by other Americans. But the abolitionist movement was growing. Uncle Tom's Cabin appeared in 1852 and sold more than 300,000 copies that year. Soon presented on the stage throughout the North, it dramatized the cruelty of slave masters and overseers and condemned a culture based on human degradation and exploitation. The election of Abraham Lincoln on an anti-slavery platform gave hope that the end of slavery was near. But by the time Lincoln took office, 7 southern states had seceded from the Union, and 4 more soon joined them. The Civil War and emancipation renewed Negro faith in the vision of a racially egalitarian and integrated American society. But Americans, having been aroused by a wartime crisis, would again fail to destroy what abolitionists had described as the sins of caste. Civil
Money.
War and, quote, emancipation.
Money, money,
unquote.
money.
Negroes volunteered for military service during the Civil War, the struggle as they saw it between the slave states and the free states. They were rejected. Not until a shortage of troops plagued the Union Army late in 1862 were segregated units of United States colored troops formed. Not until 1864 did these men receive the same pay as white soldiers. A total of 186,000 Negroes served. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 freed few slaves at first, but had immense significance as a symbol. Negroes could hope again for equality. But there were at the same time bitter signs of racial unrest. Violent rioting occurred in Cincinnati in 1862 when Negro and Irish hands competed for work on the riverboats. Lesser riots took place in Newark and in Buffalo and Troy, New York, the result of combined hostility to the war and fear that Negroes would take white jobs. The most violent of the troubles took place in the New York City draft riots in July 1863, when white workers, mainly Irish-born, embarked on a 3-day rampage, desperately.
Yeah, that's when you had your unions pop up to try to keep blacks out.
Yep.
Yeah, and wasn't it, a lot of this was also what is it? What's that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio? Gangs in New York.
Oh, Gangs in New York. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and finish up. Is there anything that you want to say on that or no?
No. I mean, they're
Poor
you know,
and
they're
lack-
pretty much spot on.
Okay.
Lacking real roots in the community, they had the most to lose from the draft. Further, they were bitterly afraid that even cheaper Negro labor would flood the North if slavery ceased to exist.
Yep.
All the frustrations and prejudices the Irish had suffered were brought to a boiling point. At pitiful wages, they had slaved on the railroads and canals, had been herded into the most menial jobs as carters and stevedores. Their crumbling frame tenements were the worst slums in the city. Their first target was the office of the provost marshal in charge of conscription, and 700 people quickly ransacked the building and set it on fire. The crowd refused to permit firemen into the area, and the whole block was gutted. Then the mob spilled into the Negro area, where many Negroes were slain and thousands forced to flee town. The police were helpless until federal troops arrived on the third day and restored control. Union victory in the Civil War promised the Negroes freedom, but not equality or immunity from white aggression. Scarcely was the war ended when racial violence erupted in New Orleans. Negroes proceeding to an assembly hall to discuss the franchise were charged by police and special troops, who routed the Negroes with guns, bricks, and stones, killed some at once, and pursued and killed others who were trying to escape. Federal troops restored order, but 34 Negroes and 4 whites were reported dead, and over 200 people were injured. General Sheridan later said, at least 9/10 of the casualties were perpetrated by the police and citizens by stabbing and smashing in the heads of many who had already been wounded or killed by policemen. It was not just a riot, but an absolute massacre by the police, a murder which the mayor and police perpetrated without the shadow of necessity. Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a time of hope.
That just didn't
The
happen there
period
either.
when the 13th, 14th,
No, yeah.
amendments were adopted, giving Negroes the vote and the promise of equality. But campaigns of violence and intimidation accompanied these optimistic expressions of a new age. The Ku Klux Klan and other secret organizations sought to suppress the emergence into society of the new Negro citizens. Major riots occurred in Memphis, Tennessee, where 46 Negroes were reported killed and 75 wounded, and in the Louisiana centers of Colfax and Coushatta, where more than 100 Negro and white Republicans were massacred. Nevertheless, in 1875, Congress enacted the first significant civil rights law. It gave Negroes the right to equal accommodations, facilities, and advantages of public transportation, inns, theaters, and places of public amusement. But the law had no effective enforcement provisions and was, in fact, poorly enforced. Although bills to provide federal aid to education for Negroes were prepared, none passed, and educational opportunities remained meager. But Negroes were elected to every Southern legislature. 20 served in the U.S. House of Representatives, 2 represented Mississippi in the U.S. Senate, and a prominent Negro politician was governor of Louisiana for 40 days.
40 days.
Local government was always open and bitter. In the press and on the platform, they were described as ignorant and depraved. Critics made no distinction between Negroes who had graduated from Dartmouth and those who had graduated from the cotton fields.
Damn.
Every available means was employed to drive Negroes from public life. Negroes who voted or held office were refused jobs or punished by the Ku Klux Klan. One group in Mississippi boasted of having killed 116 Negroes and of having thrown their bodies into the Tallahatchie River. In a single South Carolina county, 6 men were murdered and more than 300 whipped during the first 6 months of 1870.
Damn.
The federal government seemed helpless. Having withdrawn the occupation troops as soon as the southern states organized governments, the president was reluctant to send them back. In 1870 and 1871, after the 15th Amendment was ratified, Congress enacted several laws to protect the right of citizens to vote. They were seldom enforced, and the Supreme Court struck down the most important provisions in 1875 and 1876. As Southern white governments returned to power, beginning with Virginia in 1869 and ending with Louisiana in 1877, the process of relegating the Negro to a subordinate place in American life was accelerated. Disenfranchisement was the first step. Negroes who defied the Klan and tried to vote faced an array of deceptions and obstacles. Polling places were changed at the last minute without notice to Negroes. Severe time limitations were imposed on marking complicated ballots. Votes cast incorrectly in a maze of ballot boxes were nullified. The suffrage provisions of state constitutions were rewritten to disenfranchise Negroes who could not read, understand, or interpret the Constitution. Some state constitutions permitted those who failed these tests to vote if their ancestors had been eligible to vote on January 1st, 1860, a date when no Negro could vote anywhere in the South. In 1896, there were 130,344 Negroes registered in Louisiana. In 1900, after the state rewrote the suffrage provisions of its constitution, only 5,320 remained on the registration books. Essentially, the same thing happened in the other states of the former Confederacy.
It's funny how things still stay the same.
Yeah, they're going through this stuff right now. It never goes away.
Like it started with when as soon as they change the laws on voting, then you had these voter ID laws to try to
Mm-hmm.
stop people from voting. Which I already knew what that was all about because one of the guys from my state, I guess, went on the show
Mm-hmm.
and said that it was they made those laws just so they could stop black people from voting. He said that
Yeah.
on a television show, and they had to get rid of him. A Republican lawmaker. He was like one of those old dumb guys that put his
Mm-hmm.
foot in his mouth too much.
Oh, he didn't care. Yeah, he don't give a shit no more.
Yeah, he's like, yeah, it was to stop black people from voting.
So stop them Niagras.
Mm-hmm. And then they had our Republicans in our state had a chance like, no, it's not about that. And then they had to let him go, and he had some words to say for them after he left. But I mean, this, like I said, this stuff has been happening for a minute. Just seems like it, just from just this little section right here. It seems like they were passing laws but had no enforcement of them, just to, like I said, in name only. But
Yeah.
they weren't trying to enforce it.
No. They were trying to put black people back in the same place they had been. They couldn't
Yeah,
legally re-enslave them, so they try to make them as close to slaves as they could.
yeah. Second-class citizens.
Oh,
I remember,
worse than that.
what's the guy from Predator? I think Duke.
Yeah.
Bill Duke. He
Yeah.
was saying how, like, when he was growing up as a kid, if white folks used to walk down the street, they had to like step off to the side and bow their head.
That's stuff. Yeah. I think women want us to do that now.
Good luck. All right, segregation by law.
End of section 24. Recording by Maria Casper. Section 25 of the Kerener Commission Report. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. Kerener Commission Report. Chapter 5, Rejection and Protest, an Historical Sketch, Part 2, Segregation by Law. When the Supreme Court in 1883 declared the Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional, Southern states began to enact laws to segregate the races. In 1896, the Supreme Court, in Plessy v. Ferguson, approved separate but equal facilities. It was then that segregation became an established fact by law as well as by custom. Negroes and whites were separated on public carriers and in all places of public accommodation, including hospitals and churches. In courthouses, whites and Negroes took oaths on separate Bibles. In most communities, whites were separated from Negroes in cemeteries. Segregation invariably meant discrimination. On trains, all Negroes, including those holding first-class tickets, were allotted seats in the baggage car. Negroes in public buildings had to use freight elevators and toilet facilities reserved for janitors. Schools for Negro children were, at best, a weak imitation of those for whites, as states spent 10 times more to educate white youngsters than Negroes. Discrimination in wages became the rule, whether between Negro and white teachers of similar training and experience, or between common laborers on the same job. Some northern states enacted civil rights laws in the 1880s, but Negroes, in fact, were treated little differently in the North than in the South. As Negroes moved north in substantial numbers toward the end of the century, they discovered that equality of treatment did not exist in Massachusetts, New York, or Illinois. They were crowded by local ordinances into sections of the city where housing and public services were generally substandard. Overt discrimination in employment was a general practice, and job opportunities apart from menial tasks were few. Most labor unions excluded Negroes from membership or granted membership in separate and powerless Jim Crow locals. Yet when Negroes secured employment during strikes, labor leaders castigated them for undermining the principles of trade unionism. And when Negroes sought to move into the mainstream of community life by seeking membership in the organizations around them, educational, cultural, and religious, they were invariably rebuffed. By the 20th century, the Negro was at the bottom of American society. Disenfranchised, Negroes throughout the country were excluded by employers and labor unions from white-collar jobs and skilled trades. Jim Crow laws and farm tenancy characterized Negro existence in the South. About 100 lynchings occurred every year in the 1880s and 1890s. There were 161 lynchings in 1892. As increasing numbers of Negroes migrated to northern cities, race riots became commonplace. Northern whites, even many former abolitionists, began to accept the white South's views on race relations. That Northern whites would resort to violence was made clear in anti-Negro riots in New York City, 1900, Springfield, Ohio, 1904, Greensburg, Indiana, 1906, and Springfield, Illinois, 1908. The Springfield, Illinois riot lasted 3 days. It was initiated by a white woman's charge of rape by a Negro, inflamed by newspapers, and intensified by crowds of whites gathered around the jail, demanding that the Negro arrested and imprisoned be lynched. When the sheriff transferred the accused and another Negro to a jail in a nearby town, rioters headed for the Negro section and attacked homes and businesses owned by or catering to Negroes. White owners who showed handkerchiefs in their windows averted harm to their stores. One Negro was summarily lynched. Others were dragged from houses and streetcars and beaten. By the time National Guardsmen could reach the scene, 6 persons were dead, 4 whites and 2 Negroes. Property damage was extensive. Many Negroes left Springfield, hoping to find better conditions elsewhere, especially in Chicago. Protest in the early 1900s. Between his famous Atlanta Exposition address in 1895 and his death in 1915, Booker T. Washington, principal of the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in Alabama, and the most prominent Negro in America, privately spent thousands of dollars fighting disenfranchisement and segregation laws. Publicly, he advocated a policy of accommodation, conciliation, and gradualism. Washington believed that by helping themselves, by creating and supporting their own businesses, by proving their usefulness to society through the acquisition of education, wealth, and morality, Negroes would earn the respect of the white man and thus eventually gain their constitutional rights.
Yeah, the Atlanta Compromise, yeah.
Appeared a practical and sure, if gradual, way of ultimately achieving racial equality. Washington's doctrines also gained support because they appealed to race pride. If Negroes believed in themselves, stood together, and supported each other, they would be able to shape their destinies.
Where have we heard that before?
Are you listening, Trey? Are you listening, Trey?
I know, really. I hear this in this space all the time.
And that's where it comes from. And that's what because Du Bois and Booker T, because they have a dissimilar background. Because the Booker T's from the South and Du Bois is from the North, and Du Bois was born free, and Booker T, was a slave when he was a child. So that's where their outlook are different. The thing is, you have to have both. You can't have one or the other, because the reason that your towns got burned down because you didn't have the social protection. So just but you can't work your way out of this. And that's what black folks don't see. You just can't merely buckle up your bootstraps and work your way out of it.
No,
but this is where it comes from. Yeah. Well, they like I said, the Atlanta Compromise was in 1915, and this has been over 100 years, and we're still saying the same thing.
It's just funny just hearing the same stuff over and over again.
Yeah. What I'm saying, it's a pattern. That's how come I tell black folks to read. I said, you're not saying anything that hasn't been said before. And the thing is, you've been trying to do, pull yourself up by your bootstraps since 1865. Okay. I mean, should we start businesses and get into business and do for ourselves? Yeah, we should. But the thing is, you have to do both. You can't just do one or the other.
Yeah.
In the early years of the century, a small group of Negroes led by W.E.B. Du Bois formed the Niagara movement to oppose Washington's program. Washington had put economic progress before politics, had accepted the separate but equal theory, and opposed agitation and protest. Du Bois and his followers stressed political activity as the basis of the Negro's future, insisting on the inequity of Jim Crow laws and advocating agitation and protest. In sharp language, the Niagara group placed responsibility for the race problem squarely on the whites. The aims of the movement were voting rights and the abolition of all caste distinctions based simply on race and color. Although Booker T. Washington tried to crush his critics, Du Bois and the Negro radicals, as they were called, enlisted the support of a small group of influential white liberals and socialists. Together in 1909-1910, they formed the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP hammered at the walls of prejudice by organizing Negroes and well-disposed whites, by aiming propaganda at the whole nation, by taking legal action in courts and legislatures. Almost at the outset of its career, the NAACP prevailed upon the Supreme Court to declare unconstitutional 2 discriminatory statutes. In 1915, the court struck down the Oklahoma Grandfather Clause, a provision in several Southern state constitutions that, together with voting tests, had the effect of excluding from the vote those whose ancestors were ineligible to vote in 1860. 2 years later, the Supreme Court outlawed residential segregation ordinances. These NAACP victories were the first legal steps in a long fight against disenfranchisement and segregation. During the first quarter of the 20th century, the federal government enacted no new legislation to ensure equal rights or opportunities for Negroes, and made little attempt to enforce existing laws, despite flagrant violations of Negro civil rights. In 1913, members of Congress from the South introduced bills to federalize the Southern segregation policy. They wished to ban interracial marriages in the District of Columbia, segregate white and Negro federal employees, and introduce Jim Crow laws in the public carriers of the district. The bills did not pass, but segregation practices were extended in federal offices, shops, restrooms, and lunchrooms. The nation's capital became as segregated as any in the former Confederate states. East St. Louis, 1917. Elsewhere, there was violence. In July 1917, in East St. Louis, a riot claimed the lives of 39 Negroes and 9 whites. It was the result of fear by white working men that Negro advances in economic, political, and social status were threatening their own security and status.
You don't
When
say.
the labor force of an aluminum plant went on strike, the company hired Negro workers. A labor union delegation called on the mayor and asked that further migration of Negroes to East St. Louis be stopped. As the men were leaving City Hall, they heard that a Negro had accidentally shot a white man during a holdup. In a few minutes, rumor had replaced fact. The shooting was intentional. A white woman had been insulted. 2 white girls were shot. By this time, 3,000 people had congregated and were crying for vengeance. Mobs roamed the street, beating Negroes. Policemen did little more than take the injured to hospitals and disarm Negroes. The National Guard restored order. When the governor withdrew the troops, tensions were still high, and scattered episodes broke the peace. The press continued to emphasize Negro crimes. White pickets and Negro workers at the aluminum company skirmished. And on July 1st, some whites drove through the main Negro neighborhood, firing into homes. Negro residents armed themselves. When a police car drove down the street, Negroes riddled it with gunshot. The next day, a Negro was shot on the main street, and a new riot was underway. The area became a bloody half-mile for 3 or 4 hours. Streetcars were stopped, and Negroes, without regard to age or sex, were pulled off and stoned, clubbed and kicked. Mob leaders calmly shot and killed Negroes who were lying in blood in the street. As the victims were placed in an ambulance, the crowds cheered and applauded. Other rioters set fire to Negro homes, and by midnight the Negro section was in flames, and Negroes were fleeing the city. There were 48 dead, hundreds injured, and more than 300 buildings destroyed.
All because they were getting jobs at an aluminum plant.
Yeah, that was the whole reason for a lot of states not wanting black folks or Negroes in their state, because they were actually going to undercut the wages.
Yeah, because they were paying them less.
They were paying them less. They were already, capitalism already pays people dirt poor wages, and they thought the Negroes were actually going to be, an adversary to their employment. So, a lot like what goes on with the with the Latinos coming up over the border, driving down the wages.
Yeah, so that goes against pretty much, how the feminists always say feminist women get paid 78 cents to the dollar, but they can never. But that's been debunked so many times, because if that was the case, they would hire women instead of the men, because men want.
Yeah, that's what was said. They would hire women.
Yeah, but Same thing goes to here. They hire these guys, like you said, they were going to drive down wages. They didn't like that, and
Mm-hmm.
so they
Yeah.
did something about it. And police barely did anything to stop it. They just took people to the hospital. That's it.
Yeah. Well, because police ran on it.
Pretty much. Like I said earlier, a lot of the stuff was propagated through the governor and the police force.
Mm-hmm.
They're just like, just let them do what they want to do.
Yeah. We won't stop you. Okay, we'll look the other way.
Pretty much. All right, World War One and post-war violence. How much time you got? Because I don't want to take you away from anything.
No, I'm good.
Okay.
World War I and post-war violence. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, the country again faced the question whether American citizens should have the right to serve on an equal basis in defense of their country. More than 2 million Negroes registered under the Selective Service Act, and some 360,000 were called into service. The Navy rejected Negroes, except as menials. The Marine Corps rejected them altogether. The Army formed them into separate units, commanded for the most part by white officers. Only after great pressure did the Army permit Negro candidates to train as officers in a segregated camp. Mistreated at home and overseas, Negro combat units performed exceptionally well under French commanders who refused to heed American warnings that Negroes were inferior people. Negro soldiers returning home were mobbed for attempting to use facilities open to white soldiers. Of the 70 Negroes lynched during the first year after the war, a substantial number were soldiers. Some were lynched in uniform.
In uniform, yeah.
Reorganized in 1915, the Ku Klux Klan was flourishing again by 1919. Its program for uniting native-born white Christians for concerted action in the preservation of American institutions and the supremacy of the white race was implemented by flogging, branding with acid, tarring and feathering, hanging and burning. It destroyed the elemental rights of many Negroes and of some whites. Violence took the form of lynchings and riots, and major riots by whites against Negroes took place in 1917 in Chester, Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, in 1919 in Washington, D.C., Omaha, Charleston, Longview, Texas, Chicago, and Knoxville, and in 1921 in Tulsa. The Chicago riot of 1919 flared from the increase in Negro population, which had more than doubled in 10 years. Jobs were plentiful, but housing was not. Black neighborhoods expanded into white sections of the city, and trouble developed. Between July 1917 and March 1921, 58 Negro houses were bombed, and recreational areas were sites of racial conflict. The riot itself started on Sunday, July 27th, with stone throwing and sporadic fighting at adjoining white and Negro beaches. A Negro boy swimming off the Negro beach drifted into water reserved for whites and drowned. Young Negroes claimed that he had been struck by stones and demanded the arrest of a white man. Instead, police arrested a Negro. Negroes attacked policemen, and news spread to the city. White and Negro groups clashed in the streets. 2 persons died and 50 were wounded. On Monday, Negroes coming home from work were attacked. Later, when whites drove cars through Negro neighborhoods and fired weapons, the Negroes retaliated. 20 more were killed and hundreds wounded. On Tuesday, a handful more were dead, 129 injured. Rain began to fall. The mayor finally called in the state militia. The city quieted down after nearly a week of violence. The 1920s and the new militancy. In the period between the 2 world wars, the NAACP dominated the strategy of racial advancement. The NAACP drew its strength from large numbers of Southern Negroes who had migrated to northern cities, and from a small but growing Negro group of professionals and businessmen. It projected the image of the new Negro, race-proud and self-reliant, believing in racial cooperation and self-help, and determined to fight for his constitutional rights. This was reflected in the work of writers and artists known as the Harlem Renaissance, who drew upon the Negro's own cultural tradition and experience. W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of The Crisis, the NAACP publication, symbolized the new mood and exerted great influence. The NAACP did extraordinary service, giving legal defense to victims of race riots and unjust judicial proceedings. It obtained the release of the soldiers who had received life sentences on charges of rioting against
I did a video on that one.
at Houston in 1917.
Do you want to talk about it?
Oh, what it was is that there was rumors that well, in 1917, during the First World War, right, there were
Mm-hmm.
Negro troops training down in Houston, and they had heard that there was some white folks getting ready to go in and attack, the Negro barracks. So they armed themselves, and what happened was is that when they clashed, I think they killed a whole bunch of white, quite a few white folks. And so what happened is that those Negroes were court-martialed, and I think like 20 of them got hung.
Mm. Yeah, because they were still hanging people back then.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, that was the major way that you actually of capital punishment. There was no
Yeah,
electric chair or what we call lethal injection.
yeah.
So yeah, that was, yeah. I actually did a video on that one.
Do you? Is it on the Ibmore channel or is it on the Black Gnostic Speaks?
No, it's on the Ibmore channel.
Okay,
I think I did like maybe a couple years ago.
okay. I mean, if you could find it, you could always put it in the chat
Okay.
so that way people can look at it. All right, continue.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Successfully defended Negro sharecroppers in Elaine, Arkansas, who in 1919 had banded together to gain fairer treatment. They had become the objects of a massive armed hunt by whites to put them in their place, and who were charged with insurrection when they resisted. It secured the acquittal, with the help of Clarence Darrow, of Dr. Ossian Sweet and his family. The Sweets, who had moved into a white neighborhood in Detroit, shot at a mob attacking their home and killed a man. The Sweets were eventually judged to have committed the act in self-defense. Less successful were attempts to prevent school segregation in northern cities. Gerrymandering of school boundaries and other devices by boards of education were fought with written petitions, verbal protests to school officials, legal suits, and in several cities, school boycotts. All proved of no avail. The thrust of the NAACP was primarily political and legal, but the National Urban League, founded in 1911 by philanthropists and social workers, sought an economic solution to the Negroes' problems. Sympathetic with Booker T. Washington's point of view, believing in conciliation, gradualism, and moral suasion, the Urban League searched out industrial opportunities for Negro migrants to the cities, using arguments that appealed to the white businessman's sense of economic self-interest and also to his conscience. Another important figure who espoused an economic program to ameliorate the Negro's condition was A. Philip Randolph, an editor of the Messenger. He regarded the NAACP as a middle-class organization, unconcerned about pressing economic problems. Taking a Marxist position on the causes of prejudice and discrimination, Randolph called for a new and radical Negro, unafraid to demand his rights as a member of the working class. He advocated physical resistance to white mobs, but he believed that only united action of black and white workers against capitalists would achieve social justice. Although Randolph addressed himself to the urban working masses, few of them ever read the Messenger. The one man who reached the masses of frustrated and disillusioned migrants in the northern ghettos was Marcus Garvey. Garvey, founder in 1914 of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, aimed to liberate both Africans and American Negroes from their oppressors. His utopian method was the wholesale migration of American Negroes to Africa. Contending that whites would always be racist, he stressed racial pride and history, denounced integration, and insisted that the black man develop a distinct racial type of civilization of his own and work out his salvation in his motherland. On a more practical level, he urged support of Negro businesses, and through the UNIA, organized a chain of groceries, restaurants, laundries, a hotel, printing plant, and steamship line. When several prominent Negroes called the attention of the federal government to irregularities in the management of the steamship line, Garvey was jailed and then deported for having used the mails to defraud. But Garvey dramatized as no one before the bitterness and alienation of the Negro slum dwellers who, having come north with great expectations, found only overcrowded and deteriorated housing, mass unemployment, and race riots.
Yeah. Have you read The Messenger? Because I've heard it, I've just never read it.
The Messenger. I think
By
they were.
Philip Randolph.
It was a newspaper, but I never read any of the articles.
Okay.
Now I've seen. There's a movie about his life called I think it's 10,000 Men Named George, where actually he was the one that actually started the Porter strike,
Mm-hmm.
the first black union strike was under A. Philip Randolph, the sleeping porters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I may need
but
to
it actually tells the story of his life. It's a movie called
yeah,
10,000 Men
of
Named
Men named
George.
George. Okay.
Hmm.
I may need to look at that, and I may look at The Messenger too, because when I
Yeah.
saw it, I was like, I never heard of this guy before. So
Oh, yeah. He actually helped organize the 1963 March on Washington just before he
okay,
died.
okay. Um, so when it goes into Marcus Garvey, of course, we already know who he is.
Hmm.
He didn't want anything to do with this. The country. He wanted black people to go to Africa and start and find their salvation
Yeah,
through there.
yeah, which is the same thing that Nation of Islam says. There's a whole lot of Pan Africans say the same thing. Have a whole lot of organizations that believe that. But getting black people to actually move wholesale and go, and that's a tall order because Lincoln tried to get them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Back in 1860, 65, he tried to get the Negroes to actually voluntarily leave the country, and he couldn't get them to go.
Well,
And then also they had a lot of unencouragement because a lot of the Southerners still wanted to make money off of black folks. So,
and black people didn't feel like they were banished from a country that's the only country they knew.
well, with that, and plus a couple of the colonies had problems. So why leave the country that you know to go and starve someplace else? That was their thing. They didn't put enough money behind uh, getting black folks to actually get established someplace else. The reason Sierra Leone was successful because the Brits put enough money behind it. United States would just okay, just get on the boat and go.
Mm-hmm. Basically, you're put somewhere to starve to death.
Yeah, like I said, Liberia, there wasn't enough money put behind uh, Liberia because Liberia they bought Liberia in the 1790s. So Liberia had been around for like 80 something years. It's just they didn't put enough money into it.
Mm-hmm. All right. So now we're going to go to Depression, the New Deal. I think we might need to go into. Well, these are short, so they ain't going to be too long.
You got a super sticker or a cash app?
Let's see. Yep, yes, I do. Thank you, Millset Rose, $20. Thank you for the cash app. He said BGS tax. Yeah, that's it. All right,
Super
yeah.
chat, super chat, no cash apps.
If I do, it's probably just Aqua Techie. I gotta get
Okay.
my phone in the other room.
Okay.
But yeah, since these are too short, we can go through these because I want to
Okay.
go into the World War II one. But
Okay.
these two are short, so.
The Depression. Negro labor, relatively unorganized and the target of discrimination and hostility, was hardly prepared for the Depression of the 1930s. To a disproportionate extent, Negroes lost their jobs in cities and worked for starvation wages in rural areas. Although organizations like the National Urban League tried to improve employment opportunities, 65% of Negro employables were in need of public assistance by 1935. Public assistance was given on a discriminatory basis, especially in the South. For a time, Dallas and Houston gave no relief at all to Negro or Mexican families. In general, Negroes had more difficulty than whites in obtaining assistance, and the relief benefits were smaller. Some religious and charitable organizations excluded Negroes from their soup kitchens. The New Deal. The New Deal marked a turning point in American race relations. Negroes found much in the New Deal to complain about. Discrimination existed in many agencies. Federal housing programs expanded urban ghettos. Money from the Agricultural Adjustment Administration went in the South chiefly to white landowners, while crop restrictions forced many Negro sharecroppers off the land. Nevertheless, Negroes shared in relief, jobs, and public housing, and Negro leaders, who felt the open sympathy of many highly placed New Dealers, held more prominent political positions than at any time since President Taft's administration. The creation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, with its avowed philosophy of non-discrimination, made the notion of an alliance of black and white workers something more than a visionary's dream. The Depression, the New Deal, and the CIO reoriented Negro protest to concern with economic problems. Negroes conducted "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaigns in a number of cities, boycotted and picketed commercial establishments owned by whites, and sought equality in American society through an alliance with white labor. The NAACP came under attack from some Negroes. Du Bois resigned as editor of the Crisis in 1934, in part because he believed in the value of collective racial economic endeavor and saw little point in protesting disenfranchisement and segregation without more actively pursuing economic goals. Younger critics also disagreed with the NAACP's gradualism on economic issues. Undeterred, the NAACP broadened the scope of its legal work, fought a vigorous though unsuccessful campaign to abolish the poll tax, and finally won its attack on the white primaries in 1944 through the Supreme Court. But the heart of its litigation was its long-range campaign against segregation and the most obvious inequities in the Southern school systems, the lack of professional and graduate schools and the low salaries received by Negro teachers. Not until about 1950 would the NAACP make a direct assault against school segregation on the legal ground that separate facilities were inherently unequal. End of section 25. Recording by Maria Casper.
Yeah, there were plenty of schools during that time that when they were trying to desegregate schools, they did pretty much underhanded tricks to not be integrated. I gotta talk about that and make videos on that because there were a whole bunch of schools during that time.
Oh yeah,
that were, you know, because I think there was one lady, she did a whole series about schools undermining the integration process because they didn't want black children to come through there, especially a lot of them in the North.
Yeah, where have we heard that before?
Yeah, really.
and then basically underfunding black schools, which is something that the earlier in the Kerener Commission, what did they complain about? Overcrowding and underfunding of black schools in the urban areas.
And they're still doing that to this day.
Yeah,
like I said, my one of my exes, she was a teacher first, and like the whole entire hall was nothing full of nothing but substitutes. There was like only 2 teachers that were like year round.
Yeah.
And it's always in the black area. Always in the black area. Black schools, didn't have permanent teachers. It just had subs just to babysit. Those kids ain't learning nothing.
Yeah, the reason they're integrating schools now is because they don't have enough white kids, and they don't want to close down. They don't want to put their kids on the bus to go someplace else. So they're bringing black kids to white schools to keep them open.
Thank you, Mr. Z, for the $5 super chat. Says Booker T. Washington, Philip A. Randolph, and Marcus Garvey were all right and simultaneously all wrong. There was no way for them to know. Hindsight 2020.
No, it's hindsight 2020. They couldn't know.
Yeah. And Giogami with the $2 super chat. Appreciate you, sir. All right, we're going to go into World War II.
26 of the Kerener Commission report. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, Kerener Commission report. Chapter 5, Rejection and Protest, an Historical Sketch, Part 3. World War II. During World War II, Negroes learned again that fighting for their country brought them no nearer to full citizenship. Rejected when they tried to enlist, they were accepted into the army according to the proportion of the Negro population to that of the country as a whole, but only in separate units, and those mostly non-combat. The United States thus fought racism in Europe with a segregated fighting force. The Red Cross, with the government's approval, separated Negro and white blood in banks established for wounded servicemen, even though the blood banks were largely the work of a Negro physician, Charles Drew. Not until 1949 would the armed forces begin to adopt a firm policy against segregation. Negroes seeking employment in defense industries were embittered by policies like that of a West Coast aviation factory, which declared openly that the Negro will be considered only as janitors and in other similar capacities. Regardless of their training as aircraft workers, we will not employ them. Two new movements marked Negro protest: the March on Washington and the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. In 1941, consciously drawing on the power of the Negro vote and concerned with the economic problems of the urban slum dweller, A. Philip Randolph threatened a mass Negro convergence on Washington unless President Roosevelt secured employment for Negroes in the defense industries. The President's Executive Order 8802, establishing a Federal Fair Employment Practices Commission, forestalled the demonstration. Even without enforcement powers, the FEPC set a precedent for treating fair employment practice as a civil right. CORE was founded in 1942-43 when certain leaders of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a pacifist organization, became interested in the use of nonviolent direct action to fight racial discrimination. CORE combined Gandhi's techniques with the sit-in, derived from the sit-down strikes of the 1930s. Until about 1959, CORE's main activity was attacking discrimination in places of public accommodation in the cities of the northern and border states. And as late as 1961, 2/3 of its membership and most of its national officers were white. Meanwhile, wartime racial disorders had broken out sporadically in Mobile, Los Angeles, Beaumont, Texas, and elsewhere. The riot in Detroit in 1943 was the most destructive. The Negro population in the city had risen sharply, and more than 50,000 recent arrivals put immense pressures on the housing market. Neighborhood turnover at the edge of the ghetto bred bitterness and sometimes violence, and recreational areas became centers of racial abrasion. The federal regulations requiring employment standards in defense industries also angered whites, and several unauthorized walkouts had occurred in automobile plants after Negro workers were upgraded. Activities in the city of several leading spokesmen for white supremacy, Gerald L.K. Smith, Frank J. Norris, and Father Charles Coughlin, inflamed many white Southerners who had migrated to Detroit during the war. On Sunday, June 20th, rioting broke out on Belle Isle, a recreational spot used by both races but predominantly by Negroes. Fistfights escalated into a major conflict. The first wave of looting and bloodshed began in the Negro ghetto, Paradise Valley, and later spread to other sections of the city. Whites began attacking Negroes as they emerged from the city's all-night movie theaters in the downtown area. White forays into Negro residential areas by car were met by
That's where sniping
gunfire.
comes from.
By the time federal troops arrived to
okay.
halt the racial conflict, 25 Negroes and 9 whites were dead. Property damage exceeded $2 million, and a legacy of fear and hate descended on the city. Again,
You know what this sounds like? It sounds like it was
What?
just something to do. Like, I mean, seriously, it really sounds like, you just got finished watching the movie. It's like, what else we got? What else we gonna do for the rest of the night? I don't know. Let's go fuck with some niggas. That's
Or
exactly.
at the bar, well, the Negroes should be, the movie should be getting out. Let's go over there and wait for them.
It was just like a Saturday night.
Yeah, yeah. You bored, you kick the dog.
Yeah, that's what's crazy about it. It's just a thing to do. It's crazy. Thank you, Drew Main, for the $5. He said those who don't know the history are doomed to repeat it. That is true. Charles Irby for the $10 super chat. Appreciate you. I think my phone went off. And I do have a cash up. Charles Gilmore for teaching. Thank you, sir.
Appreciate you, CG3.
Yep, CG3 in the house. In the clouds watching. All right, let's go ahead and continue. Or did you want to say something about that? Or
No, go ahead.
Okay. All right.
In 1943, a riot erupted in Harlem, New York, following the attempt of a white policeman to arrest a Negro woman who was defended by a Negro soldier. Negro rioters assaulted white passersby, overturned parked automobiles, tossed bricks and bottles at policemen. The major emphasis was on destroying property, looting and burning stores. 6 persons died, over 500 were injured, and more than 100 were jailed. The post-war period. White opinion in some quarters of America had begun to shift to a more sympathetic regard for Negroes during the New Deal, and the war had accelerated that movement. Thoughtful whites had been painfully aware of the contradiction in opposing Nazi racial philosophy with racially segregated military units. In the post-war years, American racial attitudes became more liberal. as new non-white nations emerged in Asia and Africa and took increasing responsibilities in international councils. Against this background, the growing size of the Northern Negro vote made civil rights a major issue in national elections, and ultimately, in 1957, led to the establishment of the Federal Civil Rights Commission, which had the
Okay.
power to investigate discriminatory conditions throughout the country and to recommend corrective measures to the president. Northern and Western states outlawed discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations, while the NAACP, in successive court victories, won judgments against racially restrictive covenants in housing, segregation in interstate transportation, and discrimination in publicly owned recreational facilities. The NAACP helped register voters, and in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education became the triumphant climax of the NAACP's campaign against educational segregation in the public schools of the South.
So next time you have people talking about we were doing better, you should ask them, should we get rid of the Federal Civil Rights Commission or the Brown versus Board Education laws that were probably passed? Should we get rid of those?
That the with the FDR establishing the Fair Employment Act and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, yeah. Should we get rid of those?
Yeah, that's the question. If they're talking about they want to go back to how things used to be.
Well, we read how it used to be getting attacked by white folks and them driving through your neighborhoods and you can't
Shooting it up.
Yeah.
CORE, which had been conducting demonstrations in the border states, its major focus on public accommodations, began experimenting with direct action techniques to open employment opportunities. In 1947, in conjunction with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, CORE conducted a journey of reconciliation, what would later be called a freedom ride, in the states of the Upper South to test compliance with the Supreme Court decision outlawing segregation on interstate buses. The resistance met by the riders in some areas and the sentencing of 2 of them to 30 days on a North Carolina road gang dramatized the gap between American democratic theory and practice. The Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott of 1955-56 captured the imagination of the nation and of the Negro community in particular, and led to the growing use of direct action techniques. It catapulted into national prominence the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who, like the founders of CORE, held to a Gandhian belief in the principles of pacifism. Even before a court decision obtained by NAACP attorneys in November 1956 desegregated the Montgomery buses, a similar movement had started in Tallahassee, Florida. Afterward, another one developed in Birmingham, Alabama. In 1957, the Tuskegee Negroes undertook a 3-year boycott of local merchants after the state legislature gerrymandered nearly all of the Negro voters outside of the town's boundaries. In response to a lawsuit filed by the NAACP, the Supreme Court ruled the Tuskegee gerrymander illegal.
Wow. Okay.
These events were widely heralded. The new Negro had now emerged in the South, militant, no longer fearful of white hoodlums or mobs, and ready to use his collective strength to achieve his ends. In this mood, King established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957 to coordinate direct action activities in Southern cities. Nonviolent direct action attained popularity not only because of the effectiveness of King's leadership, but because the older techniques of legal and legislative action had had limited success. Impressive as the advances in the 15 years after World War II were, in spite of state laws and Supreme Court decisions, something was still clearly wrong. Negroes remained disenfranchised in most of the South, though in the 12 years following the outlawing of the white primary in 1944, the number of Negroes registered in Southern states had risen from about 250,000 to nearly 1.25 million. Supreme Court decisions desegregating transportation facilities were still being largely ignored in the South. Discrimination in employment and housing continued, not only in the South, but also in northern states with model civil rights laws. The Negro unemployment rate steadily moved upward after 1954. The South reacted to the Supreme Court's decision on school desegregation by attempting to outlaw the NAACP, intimidating civil rights leaders, calling for massive resistance to the court's decision, curtailing Negro voter registration, and forming white citizens' councils.
I might need to do some more
Revolution
research
of
on
rising
CORE.
expectations.
Yeah.
At the same time, Negro attitudes were changing. In what has been described as a revolution in expectations, Negroes were gaining a new sense of self-respect and a new self-image as a result of the civil rights movement and their own advancement. King and others were demonstrating that nonviolent direct action could succeed in the South. New laws and court decisions and the increasing support of white public opinion gave American Negroes a new confidence in the future. Negroes no longer felt that they had to accept the humiliations of second-class citizenship. Ironically, it was the very successes in the legislatures and the courts that, more perhaps than any other single factor, led to intensified Negro expectations and resulting dissatisfaction with the limitations of legal and legislative programs. Increasing Negro impatience accounted for the rising tempo of nonviolent direct action in the late 1950s, culminating in the student sit-ins of 1960 and the inauguration of what is popularly known as the Civil Rights Revolution or the Negro Revolt. Many believe that the Montgomery boycott ushered in this Negro revolt, and there is no doubt that in its importance, by projecting the image of King and his techniques, it had great importance. But the decisive break with traditional techniques came with the college student sit-ins that swept the South in the winter and spring of 1960. In dozens of communities in the Upper South, the Atlantic coastal states, and Texas, student demonstrations secured the desegregation of lunch counters in drug and variety stores. Arrests were numbered in the thousands, and brutality was evident in scores of communities. In the Deep South, the campaign ended in failure, even in instances where hundreds had been arrested, as in Montgomery, Orangeburg, South Carolina, and Baton Rouge. But the youth had captured the imagination of the Negro community, and to a remarkable extent of the whole nation. Student involvement. The Negro protest movement would never be the same again. The Southern college students shook the power structure of the Negro community, made direct action temporarily preeminent as a civil rights tactic, speeded up the process of social change in race relations, and ultimately turned the Negro protest organizations toward a deep concern with the economic and social problems of the masses. Involved in this was a gradual shift in both tactics and goals, from legal to direct action, from middle and upper class to mass action, from attempts to guarantee the Negro's constitutional rights to efforts to secure economic policies giving him equality of opportunity, from appeals to the sense of fair play of white Americans to demands based upon power in the Black ghetto. The successes of the student movement threatened existing Negro leadership and precipitated a spirited rivalry among civil rights organizations. The NAACP and SCLC associated themselves with the student movement. The organizing meeting of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, at Raleigh, North Carolina in April 1960 was called by Martin Luther King, but within a year the youth considered King too cautious and broke with him. The NAACP now decided to make direct action a major part of its strategy and organized and reactivated college and youth
SNCC.
chapters in the southern and border states.
It was Snick.
Still unknown
Yeah.
to the general public, installed James Farmer as national director in
I didn't know
January
they-
1961.
Well,
And that
I didn't know they broke from King, so I gotta,
Yeah, they did.
okay, that'd be something I need to look into too.
Yeah, he was the old Negro, and they were young.
Oh, okay, boomer back then.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Sorry, I gotta write that down.
Was doing Snick.
Yeah, and then breaking from King.
Yeah,
I want to look at that, and then core, because
yeah.
I didn't know.
I didn't know anything about Core.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because even this upcoming part says core is still unknown to general public.
Yeah, because they always associate King with the start of the nonviolent protest, but it was actually Core. Interesting.
Yeah. Thank you, Johnson. He sent a Cash App, and Nicole Ali sent me a Cash App over the weekend. She said, scientist Dr. Nicole says, honey, bring the brioche for that biatch.
Nicole ain't shit.
Thank you,
Nicole
Nicole,
ain't
for
shit.
that made my weekend when I read that.
She ain't shit. And I mean that lovingly.
I know, right?
That spring joined the front rank of civil rights organizations with the famous Freedom Ride to Alabama and Mississippi that dramatized the persistence of segregated public transportation. A bus burning resulted in Alabama. Hundreds of demonstrators spent a month or more in Mississippi prisons. Finally, a new order from the Interstate Commerce Commission, desegregating all interstate transportation facilities, received partial compliance. Organizational differences. Disagreement over strategy and tactics inevitably became intertwined with personal and organizational rivalries. Each civil rights group felt the need for proper credit in order to obtain the prestige and financial contributions necessary to maintain and expand its own programs. The local and national, individual and organizational clashes stimulated competition and activity that further accelerated the pace of social change. Yet there were differences in style. CORE was the most interracial. SCLC appeared to be the most deliberate. SNCC staff workers lived on subsistence allowances and seemed to regard going to jail as a way of life. The NAACP continued the most varied programs, retaining a strong emphasis on court litigation, maintaining a highly effective lobby at the nation's capital, and engaging in direct action campaigns. The National Urban League, under the leadership of Whitney M. Young, Jr., appointed executive director in 1961, became more outspoken and talked more firmly to businessmen who had previously been treated with utmost tact and caution. The role of whites in the protest movement gradually changed. Instead of occupying positions of leadership, they found themselves relegated to the role of followers. Whites were likely to be suspect in the activist organizations. Negroes had come to feel less dependent on whites, more confident of their own power, and they demanded that their leaders be black. The NAACP had long since acquired Negro leadership, but continued to welcome white liberal support. SCLC and SNCC were from the start Negro-led and Negro-dominated. CORE became predominantly Negro as it expanded in 1962 and 1963. Today, all executives are Negro, and a constitutional amendment adopted in 1965 officially limited white leadership in the chapters. A major factor intensifying the civil rights movement was widespread Negro unemployment and poverty. An important force in awakening Negro protest was the meteoric rise to national prominence of the Black Muslims, established around 1930. The organization reached the peak of its influence when more progress toward equal rights was being made than ever before in American history, while at the same time the poorest groups in the urban ghettos were stagnating. The Black Muslims preached a vision of the doom of the white devils and the coming dominance of the black man, promised a utopian paradise of a separate territory within the United States for a Negro state, and offered a practical program of building Negro business through hard work, thrift, and racial unity. To those willing to submit to the rigid discipline of the movement, the Black Muslims organization gave a sense of purpose and dignity. End of section 26. Recording by Maria Casper.
Heard that before too.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's 20s.
Garvey and a little mixture of Garvey and Washington. Booker T. Same thing. They keep repeating themselves.
Yeah. That's what they keep saying. Like, we need our own land and da da da. It's like, nah, we've been saying that for over 100 years now.
Oh yeah. Well, if we can get it, fine.
Yeah, but can you get it?
But the thing is, you got to ask a white man for land.
So I ain't gotta ask for nothing. Yeah, you do. We're gonna do take it by force. Yeah, good luck with that.
Good luck with that. Yeah.
How much long? We got 1 hour and 23 minutes in.
How much more you want to do?
Freedom of civil rights laws. We'll stop at failures at direction, and then Black Power. How long is that? Old wine in new bottles. We'll stop there for today, and then I'll just make some videos off these.
Okay.
Black Power, and then old wine in new bottles. Yeah, I'll stop there. So let's go a little bit longer. That'd be a good hour and a half.
Yeah.
Of knowledge. All right. So right here. Kind of Art Nostal's on. It should be on right now.
Yeah, I think he just started. He's probably playing music right now.
Yeah.
Section 27 of the Kerener Commission Report. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, Kerener Commission Report. Chapter 5, Rejection and Protest, an Historical Sketch, Part 4. Freedom Now and Civil Rights Laws. As the direct action tactics took more dramatic form, as the civil rights groups began to articulate the needs of the masses and draw some of them to their demonstrations, the protest movement in 1963 assumed a new note of urgency, a demand for complete freedom now. Direct action returned to the northern cities, taking the form of massive protests against economic, housing, and educational inequities, and a fresh wave of demonstrations swept the South, from Cambridge, Maryland to Birmingham, Alabama. Northern Negroes launched street demonstrations against discrimination in the building trade unions, and the following winter, school boycotts against de facto segregation. In the North, 1963 and 1964 brought the beginning of the waves of civil disorders in northern urban centers. In the South, incidents occurred of brutal white resistance to the civil rights movement, beginning with the murders of Mississippi Negro leader Medgar Evers and of 4 Negro schoolgirls in a church in Birmingham.
And a
These
bomb.
disorders and the events in the South are detailed in the introduction to Chapter 1, The Profiles of Disorder. The massive anti-Negro resistance in Birmingham and numerous other southern cities during the spring of 1963 compelled the nation to face the problem of race prejudice in the South. President Kennedy affirmed that racial discrimination was a moral issue and asked Congress for a major civil rights bill. But a major impetus for what was to be the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the March on Washington in August 1963. Early in the year, A. Philip Randolph issued a call for a March on Washington to dramatize the need for jobs and to press for a federal commitment to job action. At about the same time, Protestant, Jewish, and Catholic churches sought and obtained representation on the March Committee. Although the AFL-CIO National Council refused to endorse the march, a number of labor leaders and international unions participated. Reversing an earlier stand, President Kennedy approved the march. 250,000 people, about 20% of them white, participated. It was more than a summation of the past years of struggle and aspiration. It symbolized certain new directions, a deeper concern for the economic problems of the masses, more involvement of white moderates, and new demands from the most militant, who implied that only a revolutionary change in American institutions would permit Negroes to achieve the dignity of citizens. President Kennedy had set the stage for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. After his death, President Johnson took forceful and effective action to secure its enactment. The law settled the public accommodations issue in the South's major cities. Its voting section, however, promised more than it could accomplish. Martin Luther King and SCLC dramatized the issue locally with demonstrations at Selma, Alabama in the spring of 1965. Again, the national government was forced to intervene and a new and more effective voting law was passed. Failures of direct action. Birmingham had made direct action respectable. Selma, which drew thousands of white moderates from the North, made direct action fashionable. Yet as early as 1964, it was becoming evident that, like legal action, direct action was of limited usefulness. In Deep South states like Mississippi and Alabama, direct action had failed to desegregate public accommodation in the sit-ins of 1960-61. A major reason was that Negroes lacked the leverage of the vote. The demonstrations of the early 1960s had been successful principally in places like Atlanta, Nashville, Durham, Winston-Salem, Louisville, Savannah, New Orleans, Charleston, and Dallas, where Negroes voted and could swing elections. Beginning in 1961, Robert Moses of SNCC, with the cooperation of CORE and NAACP, established voter registration projects in the cities and county seats of Mississippi. He succeeded in registering only a handful of Negroes, but by 1964, he had generated enough support throughout the country to enable the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which he had created, to challenge dramatically the seating of the official white delegates from the state at the Democratic National Convention. In the black ghettos of the North, direct action also largely failed. Street demonstrations did compel employers, from supermarkets to banks, to add Negroes to their workforce in northern and western cities, and even in some southern cities where the Negroes had considerable buying power. However, separate and inferior schools, slum housing, and police hostility proved invulnerable to direct attack.
Yeah, because there were in those
Although
organizations to help I mean, they tried,
Yeah.
but they didn't. If you're not on them boards, then that's what they ain't gotta listen to you.
Nah, you got to give. You have to. Well, sometimes you got to inflict enough pain.
Which is why we had the riots.
But they had the riots, right? And then all of a sudden you can start getting all this stuff.
All right. New Direction's not that long, so we'll go through that and then we'll stop and then I'll just do videos on Black Power. That's it.
Okay.
Since that was a little bit quicker than I thought it was going to be.
Being hired in increasing numbers, mass unemployment and underemployment remained. As economist Vivian Henderson pointed out in his testimony before the commission, no one can deny that all Negroes have benefited from civil rights laws and desegregation in public life in one way or another. The fact is, however, that the masses of Negroes have not experienced tangible benefits in a significant way. This is so in education and housing. It is critically so in the area of jobs and economic security. Expectations of Negro masses for equal job opportunity programs have fallen far short of fulfillment. Negroes have made gains. There have been important gains, but the masses of Negroes have been virtually untouched by those gains. Faced with the intransigence of the Deep South and the inadequacy of direct action to solve the problems of the slum dwellers, Negro protest organizations began to diverge. The momentum towards unity, apparent in 1963, was lost. At the very time that white support for the protest movement was rising markedly, militant Negroes felt increasingly isolated from the American scene. On two things, however, all segments of the protest movement agreed. One, future civil rights activity would have to focus on economic and social discrimination in the urban ghettos. And two, while demonstrations would still have a place, the major weapon would have to be the political potential of the Black masses. By the middle of the decade, many militant Negro members of SNCC and CORE began to turn away from American society and the middle-class way of life. Cynical about the liberals and the leaders of organized labor, they regarded compromise, even as a temporary tactical device, as anathema. They talked more of revolutionary changes in the social structure and of retaliatory violence, and increasingly rejected white assistance. They insisted that Negro power alone could compel the white ruling class to make concessions. Yet they also spoke of an alliance of Negroes and unorganized lower-class whites to overthrow the power structure of capitalists, politicians, and bureaucratic labor leaders who exploited the poor of both races by dividing them through an appeal to race prejudice. At the same time that their activities declined,
I don't think I ever heard that
issues,
before.
particularly Vietnam, diverted the attention of the country and of some Negro leaders from the issue of equality. In civil rights organizations, reduced financing made it increasingly difficult to support staff personnel. Most important was the increasing frustration of expectations that affected the direct action advocates of the early 1960s. The sense of futility growing out of the feeling that progress had turned out to be tokenism, that the compromises of the white community were sedatives rather than solutions, and that the current methods of Negro protest were doing little for the masses of the race. As frustration grew, the ideology and rhetoric of a number of civil rights activists became angrier. One man more than any other, a Black man who grew up believing whites had murdered his father, became a spokesman for this anger. Malcolm X, who perhaps best embodied the belief that racism was so deeply ingrained in white America that appeals to conscience would bring no fundamental change.
All right.
All right.
Yes,
You're talking about the labor leaders. Talking about the Negro power along with white power. Is that what you're talking about?
With the lower class whites.
Lower class whites. Yeah,
that's
that's
power structure.
Yeah, they've been saying that for quite a while. In fact, remember Martin Luther King doing the Poor People's March?
Yeah. I was just making a joke.
Oh,
but
okay.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I know, because I was just like, we're coming to get our check, and we're trying to organize the lower class, saying that they're all fucking us over at the end, pretty much. So, but yeah, I mean, this is an interesting section. I got some more information I need to do some research on, because like I said, you and me, I never even heard of CORE, and neither of you either. So that'd be interesting.
I've seen the name, but I never knew what they did.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. You might have already talked about them.
Yeah. Well, that's it. Most people don't know about them.
Yeah.
because we never really looked into it. As like I said, I've heard of them, but I never knew what they did. I didn't know Martin Luther King came out of CORE.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that'd be interesting to do some research on them.
Yeah, that's why you read.
Yeah,
See what figure out why you got here.
exactly. But anything on these new direction or the failures of the direct action?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, any tactic only has a limited, a limited scope of what it can do. Like they said, it did do some things, but there's other things it didn't, and
Failed at.
it failed at. And once people get moving in a direction, they get anxious. We want this stuff to stop now. So that's like we had the riots.
Because of the failures of their action and trying to get stuff
Yeah,
done.
which
They got
Monahan had
frustrated.
already said. He had
Yeah.
already said this is what we need to actually correct these problems.
So I guess during the early 1960s,
Hmm.
that's when we probably started hearing tokenism.
Yeah,
Because it
yeah,
said up here the sense of civility growing out of the feeling of progress had
yeah,
turned out to be tokenism.
yeah. In other words, yeah, there was no economic component to it.
Yeah.
That's like King said, we're coming to get our check. But A. Philip Randolph, that was his thing. They needed job programs. You know, along with voting rights is cool, but he said you need jobs.
Yeah. You need to make sure that these jobs are protected and make sure people
Hmm.
are getting paid a fair wage too.
Hmm. But he
You
was a
know,
socialist, so that's what he would do.
well, the people in this section of YouTube be like, socialism, no, that's bad.
That's bad, yeah. But they like said, remember the section say earlier in the year, A. Philip Randolph issued a call for the March on Washington to dramatize the need for jobs and to press for federal commitment to job action. So he had already said that. He
Yeah.
had been saying it since the 30s.
Yeah, I mean, they needed to do it because of
Hmm.
the whole simple fact that we were getting kept out.
Yeah,
So they needed some type of enforcement to make sure that these jobs are actually paying these people and actually hiring, and just not doing discriminatory practices that they've been doing.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. In other words, full employment.
Hmm.
A lot like what happened underneath FDR.
Yeah.
Even though black folks couldn't take advantage of it like the white folks did during the Depression.
Hmm. So interesting section. I'm glad it went over it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, so, but I will do videos on Black Power and old wine and new bottles. So go through that. Anything else you want to talk about in this section, or
No, not really. I mean, it was a pretty decent overview for an overview. But the thing is, you can see, the way they did it, you can see why the cities blew up the way they did.
yeah, from the
You can actually
history?
see from the history. You can see the pattern,
Hmm.
and
It's
even
like
why white people attacked them, and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a pretty good overview.
yeah, no, like I said, that's why I wanted to go through it and make sure. I just didn't want to just do a video and then have no one talk over it because there's a lot of information in here.
Yeah. So basically, King, uh, King did his thing, but the thing is that this is what black people wanted back then. It wasn't something that he impressed upon them. They wanted to be integrated. They wanted a better jobs. They wanted better housing. That's what they wanted.
Yeah, he was just a mouthpiece for the
It
people.
was he was just mouthpiece for the people. That's what he was.
Yeah, because we've been fighting this for the longest since we've been in this country.
Yep.
You wanted the same thing that everybody else has, and we
Yep.
weren't getting it.
Yep.
So, um, all right, that will be it. That was like an hour and 30 or hour 38. So, with that, I will be ending the stream. Thank you, everybody, for coming through. Next Tuesday, once again, we'll be doing this. If BJS comes through, I'm pretty sure he will, but we'll be doing it on part 4. Probably going to do a couple more parts of this. 'Cause I'm not going to go through the whole entire report, but I'm just going to pick out certain sections that I want to do videos on and do lives on.
Yeah. It's really an important document to show what happened, why we got what we got, because it didn't come out of nowhere. They didn't just white folks didn't just all of a sudden say we're gonna treat our good Negroes, better. There had to be a lot of work, a lot of protests, and a lot of violence. Unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it's like what I was telling this one guy at my job. The only reason why a lot of us got the black folks got what we got is because of the violence and riots.
And the riots,
Yeah,
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 you can
we
see
had,
it because
we had to force their hand.
had to force their hand. Yeah, sure did.
Yeah, because they won't get to you for just because they were nice. It's like I'm gonna be nice and then give you a little cookie. Like, nah, we gotta make you give it a cookie.
Yeah, you had to, what it was. The power gives nothing without a demand, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you got to demand a little bit noisier than normal.
Yep.
Because them white boys burned down stuff when they were upset during their race riots.
Oh yeah, they didn't give they didn't give a fuck. It's
They
like
didn't give a fuck.
give me liberty or give me death.
And not just mine.
Yeah, exactly. They didn't say give them death. They mean give me your death.
Chase these Negroes out of the town so they can't work.
Mm-hmm.
Ain't gonna take my good government job.
Exactly. But anyway, guys, appreciate you guys for coming through. Come back next Tuesday. We'll chop it up again on the Kerner Commission. Saturdays, as you know, Saturday open hangouts as usual. But with that, I'm out. Catch you guys later. Peace.